Mormonism with the Murph, where we do a fair and objective analysis of the Church and its truth claims, its history, doctrine, and policy. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, Mormonism with the Murph, where Latter-day Saint explores the Church's history and the Church's truth claims. I will not be using my camera today, as my camera unfortunately will not work, so this is just going to be an audio presentation. In the last episode we had a look at the view of the Hebrews and the Mound Builder myth, and the outline for the Book of Mormon of Nephites and Lamanites. Did that come from the 19th century sort of environment and his milieu, believing that Native Americans had wiped out a superior white race and that they were advanced and that they built these mounds? And that parallels between the view of the Hebrews and the Book of Mormon. Did Joseph Smith take from the view of the Hebrews? Was this the source or outline for his Book of Mormon? And we had a look at maybe some of the critical arguments and apologetic responses. So go back and watch that one. In this one, we'll be looking at specifically the late war and the first book of Napoleon. And did Joseph Smith plagiarize from these books in his creation of the Book of Mormon? So let's have a dive in. So what is the late war? So this comes from Mormon Stories Truth Claims part. They say the late war between the US and Great Britain. It is a narrative of the War of 1812, written in pseudo-biblical style. It contains a remarkably high number of direct parallels in language, phrasing, and ideas with the Book of Mormon. Beyond language, use of biblical phrases such as "and it came to pass." Parallels also include the 2,000 stripling soldiers, the unique term curious workmanship, and hundreds of verses and phrases that the Book of Mormon mirrors. Further, the late war mentions a rod of iron, elephants in America, and a cataclysmic earthquake, followed by great darkness, and further asserts that God will favor and protect America if its inhabitants remain faithful. While the sharing of a biblical writing style is expected, the numerous parallel passages suggest more than an influence on tone. So both would have been written in King James Bible language style, but critics point to maybe some of the similar phrases or similar ideas in the late war paralleling the Book of Mormon, and perhaps it may have been an influence or a source. This comes from the CS letter. In addition to the above KJV language present throughout the book, what are the following Book of Mormon verbatim phrases, themes, and storylines doing in a children's school textbook that was used in Joseph Smith's own time and backyard? All of this is a mere decade before the publication of the Book of Mormon. So some of the bullet points he has here: devices of curious workmanship in relation to boats and weapons, a stripling soldier with his weapon of war in his hand, a certain chief captain was given in trust a band of more than 2,000 chosen men to go forth to battle, and who all gave their services freely for the good of their country, paralleling with the 2,000 stripling warriors, Helaman's 2,000 stripling warriors in the Book of Alma. Fortifications: the people began to fortify themselves and entrench the high places round about the city. Objects made partly of brass and partly of iron, and were cunningly contrived with curious works, like unto a clock, and as it were a large ball. Their polished steels of fine workmanship. Nevertheless, it was so that the free man came to the defence of the city, built strongholds and forts, and raised up fortifications in abundance. Talks about 3 Indian prophets, similar to the 3 Nephites, and a rod of iron, a war between the wicked and the righteous, maintaining the standard of liberty with righteousness, similar to Moroni, Captain Moroni, with the title of liberty, and righteous Indians versus savage Indians, paralleling the wars between the Lamanites and the Nephites. So the author of the CS letter says the parallels and similarities to the Book of Mormon are astounding. The webpage outlines very clearly and simply just how phenomenally unlikely it is that so many common rare phrases and themes could be found between these books without the late war having had some influence on the Book of Mormon. And former BYU Library Bibliographic Department Chairman and antique book specialist Rick Grunder states in his analysis of the late war: the presence of Hebraisms and other striking parallels in a popular children's textbook, on the other hand, so close to Joseph Smith in his youth, must sober our perspective. So this critic is making the argument that there are parallels between some of the themes and even some of the phrases in the late war and the Book of Mormon, and that this was a children's sort of textbook or a novel they would have read about the late war in pseudo King James Bible language, and that it's very possible that Joseph Smith may have had access, and this could have been an influence or a source in his creation of the Book of Mormon. On this page, I have even more of some of the similarities between the late war and the Book of Mormon. I'm not going to read all of these, but pause the screen and have a read. But some of them, I will acknowledge there are some similarities, such as the 4th of July. In the late war, it says the 4th day of the 7th month, which is the birthday of Columbian liberty and independence. In the Book of Mormon, it says the 4th day of the 7th month, which is in the 10th year of the reign of the judges. It talks about stripling soldiers, 2,000 hardy men, this is in the late war, who fought freely for their country. Now the men of war were men of dauntless courage. Now there are some ellipses between some of these phrases across the couple of verses in the Book of Mormon. This is in Alma 53. 2,000 of those young men to defend their country. They took their weapons of war, were all young men, and they were exceedingly valiant for courage. And you can see the similarities, 2,000 young men, they were defending their country. They also were men of courage as well. Talked about the Americas, the land, most plentiful, yielding gold and silver, all manner of creatures which are used for food. The huge mammoth that once moved on the borders, it is more wonderful than the elephant. That was from the late war. In the Book of Mormon, the land, exceedingly rich, of gold and of silver, all manners of animals which were useful for the food of man, and curlums and cumums, and more especially the elephants. And you can see some of the parallels here. It talks about, gold and silver, all manner of animals, good for food. In the late war, it talks about the mammoth once being on the land, and it talks about in the Book of Mormon curlums and cumums. I don't have the source or the quote for it, but I believe it might have been someone like Orson Pratt who believed that curlums and cumums were speaking of mammoths. And you can see the similarities in those verses. It says about forts, men were prepared, and they let loose their weapons of war, and smote with great slaughter, and the deep ditch that surrounded the fort was strewed with their slain and their wounded. In the Book of Mormon, it says, the men were prepared with their swords and their slings to smite with an immense slaughter, ditches filled up in a measure with their dead and wounded. So again, some similar phrasing, and you could see borrowing of things or ideas. We'll read a couple more. Talks about a standard or a proclamation in the late war. Sent for the proclamation abroad, and it came to pass that a great multitude flocked to the standard of Columbia. They came in battle array against the. And in the Book of Mormon, sent a proclamation throughout the land, and it came to pass that thousands did flock unto his standard of liberty. They went down with their enemies. So similar phrasing there again. I'm just going to read a couple more. Leahona, made partly of brass with curious works like unto a clock, and as it were a large ball. That's in the late war. In the Book of Mormon, a round ball of curious workmanship, and it was of fine brass, and within the ball were two spindles. So similar phrasing, made of brass, curious work or workmanship between the two. If we talk about weapons and weapons of war were of curious workmanship in the late war. In ether, and weapons of war of exceedingly curious workmanship. So some similar phrasing. We'll read just one more. This is about weapons. And it came to pass that the husbandmen gathered together and pitched their tents and assembled together, and the people shouted with a loud voice. And this is in Mosiah, but this is across a couple of chapters. It came to pass the people gathered themselves together, pitched their tents, ye should assemble yourselves together, and they all cried with one voice. And I'll read the very bottom one. The chief warriors gave up their instruments of destruction and laid them down, and their chief captains threw down their weapons of war in the Book of Mormon. So you can definitely see some similar maybe ideas or themes or phrasing between the late war, particularly the war chapters in Alma and the late war. So what does Bearer Latter-day Saints have to say? One critic of the church believes that the presence of a bunch of it came to pass phrases in the late war is evidence that Joseph used this phrase in the Book of Mormon. There are 1,297 occurrences of the phrase it came to pass in the Book of Mormon, while there are 387 occurrences of it came to pass in the Old Testament and 65 occurrences in the New Testament. In the Book of Luke alone, there are 40 usages of the phrase it came to pass out of 19,482 to 25,600. So if one rejects the divine origin of the Book of Mormon and is looking for an external influence, the Book of Luke is much more likely than the Late War. Moreover, Gilbert Hunt's The Late War was deliberately written in biblical style, and therefore purposely uses the phrase "it came to pass" frequently. There really isn't any reason to believe that Joseph, if he were actually the author of the Book of Mormon, would have been more likely to have picked up the phrase from the Late War than from the Bible himself. When translating the Book of Mormon, Joseph dictated in language that he was familiar with, and certainly know that Joseph read the New Testament. So what Farad are starting to say, their argument is, yes, there's maybe some similar phrases. They're focusing on the "it came to pass" one, and there are many others, and we'll talk about those in a minute. But they're saying if that phrase came from the Bible, we know that Joseph Smith knew the Bible very well. It's quite likely that both books, as they're writing in King James Bible language, that it's not necessarily the Book of Mormon taking it from the Late War, but both were written in King James Bible language. A better argument to, in a naturalistic point of view, to argue that the Book of Mormon is coming and being influenced or borrowed from the Bible over the Late War. But we'll have a look at some of their other arguments. So Farag goes on to say the conference at which Chris and Dwayne Johnson presented their findings was held in October 2013. I think it was the ex-Mormon conference. I'll link it in the description if people want to check it out. In that same month, Latter-day Saint literary theorist Benjamin L. McGuire published a response to the findings of the brothers in The Interpreter, a journal of Mormon scripture, using similar methods. He concluded that the Late War likely had little to no influence on the composition of the text of the Book of Mormon. That was followed in November 2013 by a piece by Bruce, I think it's Sheljay, giving a Bayesian analysis of the likelihood that Joseph Smith used the Late War in the composition of the Book of Mormon. Similarly, concluding that it is unlikely that Joseph Smith was influenced by the Late War in the composition of the Book of Mormon. Finally, in 2018, Latter-day Saint linguist Stanford Carmack compared the syntax and morphosyntax of the Late War, King James Bible, and Book of Mormon, and concluded that the Late War did not have influence on the composition of the Book of Mormon. As of 2022, the Johnsons have not disputed any of these conclusions in scholarly venues. So they're arguing that scholarly analysis shows that it's very unlikely that the Late War was a source for the composition of the Book of Mormon. I will acknowledge I did see some similarity in some of the phrases and themes, so you could possibly argue that he may have been influenced, but I think, according to what Farah is saying, scholars are concluding that using it as the source for the Book of Mormon seems unlikely. What about Hebraisms in the Late War? So there's no evidence that Joseph knew about this work or that it was used in a school near him. Joseph did not have any formal schooling except for maybe the one winter with the Stoll children when he was 17 years old. As it stands, not every Hebraism employed in the Late War is employed in the Book of Mormon. Of those that Chris and Dwayne Johnson cite, there are chiasmus, cognate accusatives, negative questions, construct state, compound prepositions, and adverbials. Even these do not account for all Hebraisms in the Book of Mormon. So not all the Hebraisms that are in the Book of Mormon come from the Late War. Some are unique to the Book of Mormon, but Hebraisms do occur in the Late War because apologists do point to maybe chiasmus and Hebraisms in the Book of Mormon, which sort of point to it being an ancient text, to it having ancient sort of origin and authenticity, almost coming from Hebrew. But some of these Hebraisms come also in the Late War, you could argue, because it's written in King James Bible language, the translation. We're going to watch a little video from Brian Hales as he talks about the strengths of the parallels between the Late War and the Book of Mormon, and also the differences as well, because I think those are important as well. So let me just make sure I've got my sound.
Criticism of the Book of Mormon, parallelomania. The CES letter provides an internet link to a website with many reported parallels between the Late War and the Book of Mormon. It also prints a bullet list of 26 parallels that are evidently the most extraordinary. The list seems impressive until we look more closely. Some of the parallels do not seem that significant. For example, a rod of iron is one of the 26, but when we compare its usage in the Late War to that of the Book of Mormon, we discover some significant differences. The late war recounts, "Then will we rule them with a rod of iron, and they shall be unto us hewers of wood and drawers of water." In contrast, the Book of Mormon defines the rod of iron as the Word of God. The rod of iron refers to a totally different object in the Book of Mormon when compared to the late war. This observation supports that claims of parallelism in the CES letter should probably be verified before believed. Of greater significance is the observation that the CES letter does not account for important non-parallelisms between the two books. If we simply compare some of the most commonly used words in each volume, we discover remarkable dissimilarities. For example, words like baptism, priesthood, Holy Ghost, and church are used dozens or even hundreds of times in the Book of Mormon, but are entirely absent from the late war. It is also obvious from this study that themes like judgment and salvation that are important in the Book of Mormon are missing from the late war. If we reverse the search, we discover many words that are common in the late war, but are seldom or never used in the Book of Mormon, including the word capture, which is found 262 times in the late war, but is absent from the Book of Mormon. The undeniable dissimilarities and non-parallelisms create additional questions regarding claims of parallelism between the Book of Mormon and the late war. But what about the first book of Napoleon?
Okay, right, I'm going to pause it there. I will look at the Book of Napoleon in a wee minute. Okay, so that was a clip from Brian Hales talking about the late war. And yes, you can see that there are maybe some parallels. We looked at some of the similar phrasing, particularly that from the late war, and similarities to the war chapters and some of the things that they both talk about. But there's also dissimilarities as well, which need to be taken into account, that it seems very unlikely that he is plagiarizing from the late war because there are so many striking differences. However, a critic might say that, well, maybe he's not necessarily taking everything from the late war. Perhaps he's read it, perhaps he's taking certain things, borrowing some phrasing from it, but there are stark differences. What about the Book of Napoleon? So let's have a look at that one. So the Book of Napoleon, very few scholars deny the similarity of writing between the Book of Mormon and the first Book of Napoleon. The opening of the book provides some idea of its style. And behold, it came to pass in these latter days that an evil spirit arose on the face of the earth, and greatly troubled the sons of men. And this spirit seized upon and spread amongst the people who dwell in the land of Gaul. Now in this people the fear of the Lord had not been for many generations, and they had become a corrupt and perverse people, and their chief priests and the nobles of the land, and the learned men thereof, had become wicked in the imaginations of their hearts, and in the practice of their lives. Now, I'll be honest, that did sound quite similar to the Book of Mormon, as it came to pass. We have also in there about the wickedness in the imagination of their hearts, which is a very similar phrase as well. And you could say that, this sounds a lot like the Book of Mormon. In the CS letter, it also goes on to say, condemn not the writing and account, the first book of Napoleon, upon the face of the earth. It came to pass, the land, their inheritances, their gold and silver, the commandments of the Lord, the foolish imaginations of their hearts, small in stature, Jerusalem, because of the perverse wickedness of the people. There were ellipses between those pauses. This is from the first book of Napoleon. And similarly, in the Book of Mormon, it says, condemn not the writing and account, the first book of Nephi, upon the face of the earth. It came to pass, the land, his inheritance, and his gold and his silver, the commandments of the Lord, the foolish imaginations of his heart, large in stature, Jerusalem, because of the wickedness of the people. And you could say those are similar sounding phrases. So is Joe Smith just plagiarizing or taking them from the Book of Napoleon? This comes from Fair Latter-day Saints. So fact-checking, this claim contains propaganda, as the author or the author's source is providing information or ideas in a slanted way in order to instill a particular attitude or response in the reader. The spin, it is only shocking if you look at the heavily edited paragraphs presented by the critic. The facts. One has to examine over 25 pages in the first book of Napoleon in order to assemble these phrases, including pulling phrases from the table of contents and the first 3 chapters. This is hardly the beginning of the first book of Napoleon. The logical fallacy, the Texas sharpshooter, the author located some pattern in the data that he or she believes was the cause of something else, despite the lack of any supporting connection, and asserted that this was, in fact, the actual cause. In this case, the critic scours a book in order to extract similar phrases, and then declares them that this proves that this book was a source for the Book of Mormon. And we're going to have a look at the ellipses and how many pages are between some of these ellipses. And we're going to go back to the video that Brian Hales did looking at the ellipses.
These two paragraphs do appear to be similar. But what about all the dots, the ellipses, which indicate words have been left out? If we thumb through Napoleon's first book, we discover that the paragraph available in the CES letter is really a collection of excerpts of one or more words taken from the first 25 pages of the book. Hundreds of words have been left out, and some of the words chosen are not impressive, like "it came to pass." We also realize it is not an actual paragraph or anything close to it. Sometimes multiple pages are skipped, and single words like land and Jerusalem do not seem to be too significant. Similarly, the words included from the Book of Mormon are taken from multiple pages.
Okay, so I think that video, Brian Hales highlighted that uh, although there's those similar phrases, that there are pages in between, and it sort of stretches credulity to think that Joseph Smith is plagiarizing or taking those phrases from the Book of Napoleon, plagiarizing when there's pages in between some of those ellipses. And in my view, I think the similarities in some of those phrases is because both of them were written in King James Bible English, and I do not believe that the Book of Napoleon was by any means a source for the Book of Mormon. But let's go on to read some more about why similar phrasing then in both books. Most of the similarities occur simply because both the Late War and the Book of Mormon use the language of the King James Bible. Most of the similarities occur because they both use the language of the King James Bible. For both, the language choice seems like a stylistic decision, not determined by the content, and in fact, the Book of Mormon quotes from Isaiah a couple of dozen chapters. This creates a relationship between the Bible and both these books. The computer model doesn't have a way of separating style or word choice from content and meaning. Both texts can use the same phrase in different ways. We have to read it to realize while one is simply copying the Bible or mining it for phrases, the other is creating theological discussion by taking a passage and expanding on it. So both may sound similar in their phrasing because they're written in biblical King James Bible style, but it doesn't show that it is taking it from that book itself. I don't find certainly the parallels between or the similar phrasing between the Book of Napoleon and the Book of Mormon strong. I think some of the phrases between the late war, some of the themes, some of the parallels, I think you can make maybe a stronger argument in my view. But I think also the King James Bible might seem like a better source and a better argument for where this language and similar language and phrases was coming from. This is a critic's thoughts on the late war and view of Napoleon. This comes from LDS Discussion. He says, I want to be clear that I do not believe that Joseph Smith plagiarized either book, as some critics contend. The point in citing these 3 passages from the late war is to show that the style of speaking in the style of King James English, which was very prevalent in Joseph Smith's time and place, and from the late war, it was very common in Joseph Smith's day for preachers to speak in King James Bible language, just as it was common for books to be written that emulated the language. While I do not believe Joseph Smith plagiarized these books, I do believe that these ideas influenced the Book of Mormon as he produced it. I think he emulated the voice of Scripture to give the Book of Mormon more credibility and authenticity as an ancient record. And there's no way we can really know if Joseph Smith read those books or not. There's not evidence to support either way. I do think it's a more sophisticated critical argument to say that he may not have plagiarized from these books, from these sources. You could argue that they mimic King James Bible English, and as Joe Smith was in this cultural milieu, swimming in his environment, hearing sermons in King James Bible English, sermons from preachers, that might have influenced him dictating the Book of Mormon in King James Bible English, and there being similar phrasing, similar even themes to the other books, because both are sort of dependent upon the King James Bible. So my conclusion slide. Some critics claim that Joe Smith borrowed phrases or ideas from the Late War and the Book of Napoleon. While there are some similarities in phrasing and language, there are often pages between, and many of the oh my gosh, I'm doing so bad. While there are some similarities in phrasing and language, there are often pages between many of the ellipses that critics present as striking parallels. That was certainly clear in the Book of Napoleon. Again, I do think you could maybe argue some similarities were a bit closer in the Late War. Apologists argue some of the similar sounding language is because both books, like the Book of Mormon, were written in King James Bible English, which was the religious language of the day. I do not know whether Joe Smith read or borrowed ideas or phrases from either of these books. There's no evidence to support it. No witnesses claim that he had any book present during the translation. And similar to the view of the Hebrews, if I were a critic, I would be hesitant to state that Joe Smith was plagiarizing or borrowing phrases or ideas from these books. But you could argue that they both came out of the 19th century sort of milieu he was swimming in. You know, the mound builder myth, King James Bible language. You could maybe even argue that there's some similarities in the themes and parallels between the war chapters and the War of 1812. And if Joe Smith had read this, this could have influenced the wars in the Book of Mormon and some of the phraseology. I think a stronger argument is made, though, that the Book of Mormon is more dependent upon the King James Bible and borrowing from the King James Bible than from the Late War and the Book of Napoleon. But that sums up this video. In the next one, we'll be maybe moving on to things to do with anachronisms in the Book of Mormon, textual anachronisms as well. But I really wanted to cover these because critics talk a lot about plagiarism in the Book of Mormon from these other books. I didn't include a slide on the Solomon Spaulding manuscript, but that's been sort of debunked by scholars. Even most critics reject that as being a source for the Book of Mormon as well. But thanks so much for watching this video, and I'll see you next time. Thanks everyone for watching this video. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a thumbs up, like, share, comment, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. You can listen to my episodes on podcast form on Anchor or Spotify, and you can also follow me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. If you care to donate, you can via my PayPal or Patreon. Thanks for joining Mormonism with the Mirth. Take care. Bye-bye.